Good? Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Inshallah, it's good to be back. I like coming back over here. Tonight, we are going to continue with the same subject, which is part 2 of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which we said at the core has the subject that we know as a riba. And during the course of this talk, you'll come to know further about what John Perkins writes. So we're going to expand on the subject John Perkins wrote in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, by referring to some more material. And the material we'll be referring to, that one I used in preparation of the talk, is a second book by John Perkins, which is a continuation, you can say, of his first book. Also, papers known as the Vinogradov papers, and inshallah I'll explain what those papers are. Some writings of Sheikh Imran, and some other observations also. So inshallah, before we continue with part 2, let me just give a brief summary or high-level summary of part 1. John Perkins, the author, his job was to come up with fake economic forecasts. We talked about that, fake economic forecasts, right? For countries, so that those countries can be sold the proposition of taking huge loans from creditor organizations like IMF, World Bank, etc., etc. And that these huge loans will be used for mega projects development. And these mega projects development will not benefit the people of the country. It will benefit the creditor organizations or lenders and U.S. corporations, because this money would be spent on U.S. corporations to build the mega projects. Some elite, some rulers, etc., in those third world countries or developing countries also would benefit as they join the quote-unquote network of the system. Right. As Perkins' mentor, and we identified her name, Claudine, as he writes in his book, had explained to Perkins that the purpose of his job was to bankrupt the countries through debt entrapment, by selling these ideas for mega projects, by coming up with the economic forecasts. The purpose of entrapping them into debt is to massively transfer the wealth of those people from those countries to the lender countries, to the lender institutions, to the richer, you can say, population of the world. Basically, as Perkins explained, some corporations, some families who control the wealth. And in doing so, they target various countries, and these countries, if they do not buy into this logic, the system will not leave them alone. System will pursue with what we identified as a different kind of hitman called the jackal. And the job of the jackals is to arrange for accidents, assassinations, as he writes. And if that doesn't work, even wars get started. But the countries are not left alone. Now, the aid organizations are the key institutional tools for this enslavement, as Perkins calls it. There is an economist by the name of Joseph Stiglitz. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He writes in his famous book, I'm referring to these creditor organizations like IMF being the tools of the system, right? He writes that in his book called Globalization and Its Discontents. He writes that the GDP numbers, GDP is gross domestic product. That is not the budget of the country. It includes a monetary translation of all activities. So if you're staying home, making food, dropping kids to the school, etc., all that activity, if you say per hour charges so much, it's all of that activity collectively together, your whole production expressed in dollars or something, it's the gross domestic product. So Stiglitz says that the GDP numbers used by IMF for the purpose, are used for the purpose of making it seem like the IMF programs of giving loan for development, the programs work. It is for this purpose and they have nothing to do with reality. See, who is writing this? Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, ironically, was the chief economist for World Bank. And I think he had different thoughts. I think it can say change of heart or change of mind about what globalization is. Now, we also learned, and I'm still summarizing from last time, we also learned that when the economic hitman fails to convince the leadership of a country to accept those large loans, the jackal steps in, accident happens. And we looked at the cases of the economic devastation of some countries, in particular Ecuador, if you recall. Right? And we also looked at the deaths in fiery airplane crashes of two presidents in Latin America. One was Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama. And you remember. And then we also looked at a different technique or different method that was used in the case of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. You remember that, right? And we'll be covering a little bit more of that, actually, the history behind those different methods tonight, inshallah. And you'll find it interesting, I think. Obviously, the loans given to all these countries can never be repaid because those countries are poor. The idea is the loans are never repaid. But you'll think that, if you are a creditor, if you are giving loans to someone, not someone, you're giving loans to everyone, and you know that they are not going to return your loan, what's going to happen to you? You'll go bankrupt if there's no hope for returning. But that doesn't happen. How is that possible? And how is it possible that these creditors do not go out of business? And Perkins says, and we'll expand on this, is that this is possible because the United States prints currency that is not backed by gold. And this is the key point of tonight's discussions, inshallah. It is only backed by something intangible called the world confidence in our economy. Not something tangible like gold, but some intangible like the world's confidence in our economy, right? And the ability to print currency means we can, or the creditors can continue making loans ad infinitum, means endlessly. You print money, you give out loans, right? Or pulling it out of thin air, as we'll say. So let's examine one such organization, one creditor organization, IMF. I mean, you could look at World Bank, etc., etc. There are other ways of giving what is called as aid. Well, let's look at the history of IMF. IMF stands for International Monetary Fund, right? Whose stated purpose is to help countries develop, come up to par with developed countries, and prosper. This is the stated purpose. But we saw the statistics last time. IMF gets funds from wealthy countries, mainly from United States. They are contributors of funds to IMF countries. And United States contributes the most money to IMF, more than any other country, right? And the poor countries or developing countries are the borrowers. So you can say indirectly, most countries borrow most money from the United States, right? How is that possible? That's possible because the United States has the most money to give out most money. But does she? Does she have most money? And we're going to look at this question, right? Let's pause and ask, as I said, a silly question. If you're looking to borrow some money from someone in the community, would you go to a person whose back is almost breaking with debt? You'll not go, right? You'll go to someone who has money. United States so how come United States has this capacity to keep on lending money? Particularly given the fact that every child who is born at birth, and I'm giving you last year's number, about 15 months ago, at birth, this child is saddled with a debt of $50,000. Every child at birth is saddled with a debt. This is the standing debt, right? And U.S. foreign debt stands at, and this is again last year's numbers when I first presented this talk, 436% of the GDP. We're not talking about budget, 436% of GDP. Under these conditions, how do you think the United States can afford to keep on giving loans and be quote unquote generous with money? I will learn about it, inshallah. Obviously, this is because they can print money at will, or someone can print money at will, which is given as aid or loan from the United States through institutions, etc. So let's look at the history of IMF. Some historical background is necessary, and this is now our part 2 talk, essentially. So towards the end of World War II, the winners or the victors of that war, they got together in upstate New York in a place called Bretton Woods. Have you heard of Bretton Woods? Okay. So they got together in Bretton Woods. That was in 1944. And they met to establish a new world monetary system or a new world monetary order. And this was a small group of countries crafting a new monetary system. Small group of countries. Remember, now there are lots of countries in the world, but in 1944, most of the third world, nearly all of the third world, was still under physical colonization. I use the term physical colonization, which they were given what is called an independence, but they are no longer physically colonized, but they are colonized in other ways. So this monetary system would be based on the system of paper money. Paper money, the concept of paper money originated in Western Europe. So it would be based on the European system of paper money. And prior to that, money was gold and silver. Prior to that, from time immemorial, confidence had resided in gold as the absolute. From time immemorial. And so, when they crafted this system in 1944, they decided they should have some linkage with gold. Gold, historically being money, had the credibility because that money carried its value in itself intrinsically. That coin has its value in itself, right? Even if you melt it, sell it, you get its value, right? So that was the reason. So they decided they should have some linkage with gold because to render integrity to the scheme that they were constructing. Right? So they reached an agreement on a new system, and it's a very interesting system to say the least. It was then known as the Bretton Woods Accord, an agreement, under which one currency, the US dollar, would be redeemable in gold at the rate of $35 for every ounce of gold. That means for every $35 that are in circulation somewhere in paper, there exists in the safekeeping an ounce of gold that can be obtained by anyone if you produce those $35 in paper if you want it. Because that paper was essentially a representation of that money equivalent stored in gold somewhere. Are we clear so far on this? And all other currencies would have their values expressed in terms of dollar. They would not be expressed in terms of gold or silver. All other currencies. So dollar had this special privilege, monopoly, hegemony, if you will, that all other currencies would be expressed only in terms of dollars. And the initial values of those currencies were set at that time that a dollar is equal to so many taka of Bangladesh or so many rupiah of Indonesia, whatever, right? But there was they said the money is redeemable, right? There's a linkage to gold. But there was a caveat to this redeeming of dollars from money. The Bretton Woods Accord said that only governments through central banks can redeem their dollar paper for gold. individuals like you and me, if we possessed the dollars, we couldn't go to a bank and say, I want my gold, right? Only central banks, like, if you have a reserve bank in India, Reserve Bank of India, or some central bank that serves as the government's authority, as a reserve bank, right? So why if there is supposed to be gold for every $35, why would an individual not be permitted to go and redeem? If you can think of a reason, now we can say, not just by speculating, but confidently, the intention was to cheat or even defraud people, right? This was a built-in mechanism to cheat, actually. It's a very strange logic, and if we come in Q&A, I'll explain. There's a good technical word in English that describes this, that explains this logic. So this arrangement under international law made it obligatory that if a government through central bank comes up with paper dollar, United States will have to provide an equivalent of gold at that rate, $35 for an ounce. This was under this international treaty, international agreement, international law, as precipitated in this accord called the Bretton Woods Accord. That was a legal international obligation, right? Further, there was other issues with this Bretton Woods Accord. The accord expressly prohibited member countries from using gold as money. You couldn't use gold as money. Many people do not know this. Even people in all those countries, who just live, they do not know this, that the accord prohibited those countries from using gold as money. And this was another big hole in the system. Why wouldn't you want to use gold? It's a system, it has always been in use, right? Why wouldn't you want to use? From the time of Adam alayhi salam up to Bretton Woods Accord in 1944, gold was always valid money. Always permissible, always valid money. From the time of Adam alayhi salam until 1944. The question is, should Muslims accept such conditions? Should they enter into such accords, into such agreements? And we'll see. We want to seek answer to this question. What does Islam have to say? And as we said in our first talk, and I think the second talk also, we go to find answers first where? Where do we start? We start with the Quran. And verse number 31 of Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and I'm just going to give you the equivalence of some translation, which says that, they have taken their priests and their monks and crushed the son of Mary as their lords besides God. And continues, the ayah, same ayah continues, says, and Allah is far removed from such shirk. So obviously taking those priests and rabbis as their lords and gods would mean that is shirk, right? Clearly, we understand this part. But a man came to Prophet ﷺ and he said, why is the Quran saying that these people take the priests and monks and rabbis? I know they don't take them. They don't worship them. They are priests and monks. They're not gods. He came to the Rasulullah ﷺ for an explanation. And Rasulullah ﷺ explained. He said, did they not make halal what Allah made haram? You must have come across this hadith. Did they not make halal what Allah made haram? So now let's spend a little time. Now we can understand this ayah. We can understand more comprehensively this verse, right? So the rabbis and the priests, etc., by declaring permissible what Allah made impermissible, or vice versa, declaring impermissible what Allah made permissible, have stepped into the dominion of, or you can say the authority of Allah, right? So by doing so, they commit shirk. But the verse says they have taken their lords. They were committing shirk. So if they subscribe to what the rabbis and the priests and the monks say, and they accept it, they are committing shirk. This is the explanation that comes from this hadith. Okay. Now, if the big question is, if the use of gold and silver has been made permissible by Allah, it doesn't have to be a rabbi or a priest making it impermissible. Anybody, an institution, a president or a dictator, he says this is not permissible. What Allah has made permissible, he says it's impermissible. And you accept it. That is shirk. I mean accept willingly, obviously. So that is shirk. So gold and silver as money has always been not only used, it has not only been permitted, it was practiced, and the Quran talks about dinar and dirham. Dinar is gold and dirham is silver. It was also gold was always money. Now comes an institution that says this is impermissible. You cannot do it. And you as entities, population groups that come together as a country, you sign on it. What have you done? So if we have time in Q&A, if you raise a question, I'll explain to you that the implications are really serious. And we'll refer to a hadith in explaining this, how the implications are serious. If you remind me, inshallah. I want to continue with the flow. And there was another intriguing condition when IMF was formed. IMF was formed as part of the Bretton Woods Accord. Okay, at that time it was formed. Each member state was required to deposit 25% of their gold reserve that they had with IMF. If you had this arrangement, why do you have to give your 25% of gold? Can you think of a reason? That gold is not being used to back your currency, and if your currency is being backed by gold, you should have your own gold. And smart people don't part company with their most valued possession, their absolute values. But the countries deposited 25% of the value. There was another condition, is that subsequent to that, you will notify IMF of all gold transactions. Each country will know how much they bought, how much they sold. So what happens now? IMF has the ability to track and know at all times how much gold you possess as a country. Right? And why would a country be required to share that information? You would think your absolute well going back in terms of gold. Could even be one of your state secrets. You know. So the Bretton Woods Accord gave the dollar the privileged position of being the currency for international trade and reserve. Okay, so it was a hegemony, you can say. It was a monopoly. And that's a powerful privilege. And if you look at it, after World War II, the United States became a superpower, and this was at the core of United States becoming a superpower, the dollar. Now you might remember, you might have had these such experiences before, that if you went to, for example, Cairo, you have gone to Cairo, right? You stayed at a hotel. You are checking out, you want to pay for your stay with Bangladeshi taka. What happens? They'll probably laugh at you, right? If they're polite. No one accepts Bangladeshi taka over there. Oh, you give dollar, they will take dollar. You could go to India, walk into any bank, and readily you can change dollars to the local currency, right? But let's say if you come to New York, right? You take a cab and you want to pay the cab driver in Indonesian rupiah or Bangladeshi taka. Or you go to a coffee shop, or go to a bank, whatever. No one will honor. So this was not a free, fair system. Okay. If you had to send money, let's say from Bangladesh to Kenya, right? You will not send the money in Bangladeshi takas or in the Kenyan pounds. You will save dollars. You will send dollars. So there's a conversion here, and there's a conversion there at the receiving end. This kept up the demand for dollar, and there's a cut involved in these things, right? So at Bretton Woods, when this arrangement was being worked out, the French were not happy. They were not happy with this. They thought this gave dollar and privileged monopoly at the expense of everybody else, and this was unfair. This is how the French felt at that time. But, it was a small club, and they were outmaneuvered by the United States and her allies, chiefly Britain and so on and so. And this is how the Bretton Woods Accord came, and even French became part of that, right? So as many countries came out of colonization, right? Big countries came. 1947, India became independent, and there was a wave in Africa. It went on to the 60s and even 70s, right? So as the countries came out of physical colonization, they were brought into, quote unquote, the international community or the community of nations. So they had to find their way. They had to join the international community organizations like United Nations, IMF, International Olympic Committee. Right now you have to become part of the community of nations. So they were helped becoming part of this. Many countries were helped by the former colonizers. And I would put it simply like, helping them with fill out the application forms for membership to all these institutions. I'm stating it oversimply, of course, but you get the point, what I'm trying to convey here. And so this is how these countries were sucked into the system of the international order then. Now the Accords, Bretton Woods Accords, it worked well as the planners planned for about 25 years, a little over 25 years, right? And during this time, from time to time, the French used to complain. And they used to complain. They never forgot that this was an unfair system. They used to complain. The French President Charles de Gaulle stood up on the floor of the French Parliament, and he denounced the system as fraudulent. He denounced the system as fraudulent. He had the courage to speak out. No other leaders spoke out against this system. And I think I mentioned in the Q&A session last time, incidentally, I'm not saying it's directly connected with it, but incidentally, there was an assassination attempt on Charles de Gaulle, and there was a movie made, I mentioned the movie last time, and it was made in the 60s, called The Day of the Jackal. There the jackal stands for the assassin who attempted that assassination, right? I think it's an interesting observation that 40 years later we read John Perkins' book and we find out that in the community of economic hitmen there is someone called Jackal, and the Jackal's job is what that movie says is the job, which is assassinations of leaders of countries, right? As Perkins writes. So in 1971 was the year after Charles de Gaulle of France had died. After complaining a number of times over the years, what the French did was the French came to the United States with $3.5 billion in paper money. And they said, we want our gold. They had asked for a little gold before, and now they came with $3.5 billion. You can do the calculation, that's a few million ounces of gold, right? Of course, 3.5 billion at that time was a lot of money compared to today. More money, much more money. So the Americans were absolutely upset at the French, at their audacity. I mean, what do you mean? The French logic was very simple. I mean, this is an international accord. This is an international agreement under which dollar has the privilege, and this is how it's supposed to work. The accord, one of the the rules of this is that if any central bank comes and brings paper money, the United States is supposed to redeem it for gold. They're just asking, I mean, they're only asking for you to live up to the terms of agreement, while the rest of the world is living up to the agreement of the accord, right? So the U.S. had to part with gold. They gave out the gold. You can imagine if it was like a little country, let's say like, I gave 2-3 examples of Bangladesh. I didn't mean to pick on Bangladesh, but suppose it was Bangladesh. Do you think they would have received the gold? We don't know the answer, but it would not be as easy as it was for French, for sure, right? So within days after France received the gold, President Richard Nixon, he was the president at that time, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States will no longer redeem paper dollar for gold, even if it's brought by the central banks of countries. That was part of the Bretton Woods. Will not redeem. So what he essentially is saying is that we signed an international treaty, we agreed, we brought people into it, but we don't think we're going to keep it, we're going to break it. So he said, we gave our word, but we're not going to keep it, basically. We're not going to honor our commitment. Essentially, that's the translation, right? And I don't know how many Muslims take notice of such things, but we should take notice of these things, because this is how life is transacted on this planet. Money is a key thing for transaction of life on the planet, and this is a system of money, right? Remember how Surah Al-Ma'idah begins? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. When you give your word, you keep it. When you enter into a covenant, you live by it. When you shake hands, you better perform. When you sign a contract, you must deliver on the contract. You must keep your word. So what was the problem? Why did the United States refuse to redeem paper dollar for gold, even from central banks? Why did the United States refuse to live by this agreement, which was international law, right? The answer is that the US was secretly printing more money than there was gold. And this way you get free money, you can do a lot of things, right? And one of the things the United States did at that time was to finance the Vietnam War from such money. You have more money. Everybody else in the world is thinking there's gold behind it, so this is real money, right? But since it is only dollar that is used for international reserve and trade, printed more, you can go and everybody will take it as real money. So if more countries came, like France, dollar hegemony would be over. It was finished, and it was very natural after that, that it was to be expected. So Nixon decided we're going to announce we are not going to keep our word. And then he essentially, what he did was he ripped apart the Bretton Woods agreement. So Bretton Woods was dead, nearly dead. It was actually dead. IMF survived, of course, which was a byproduct of the Bretton Woods Accord. He said, so now dollar is in trouble, right? Everybody would bring their paper and want gold, and the system would be finished. So you can understand now why individuals were not permitted to redeem. Because the individuals are more likely to come again and again, right? Your daughter is getting married, you want some gold, you want some jewelry, etc. You know where one of the most unknown amount of gold resides? They say, some people say up to 1/3, and this is not scientific. You know where it resides?
Besides Fort Knox?
Besides
Fort Knox?
Yeah, 1/3 of the gold. It resides with the Indian woman. The Indian woman is smart. There's a tradition in India. They give to the daughter and the granddaughter and so on and so forth, right? Because it's real wealth. It comes handy in times of distress, etc. So they say 1/3. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's scientific, but it's quite possible. I'm familiar with that tradition, so it's quite possible. It's a huge population, and it's a prolific practice. Everybody has it. Now there's a problem with printing this extra money as they were printing. That's actually a huge problem, because this printing such money causes inflation. And what does inflation do? What does it do to the value of your savings? It erodes it. It doesn't keep its value, right? If you say in 50 years ago, if you had $100, right, you could you could rent an apartment then. Today you need 20 times that much, right? Maybe in our Bay Area, maybe even more than 20 times that much. $100 wouldn't do much, right? If you're a young man, you came across, saw a young lady and you were going to marry her and you are dreaming, you say, I'm going to keep a little money, maybe $15, because you could buy kharoof for $15 at that time, for my first grandchild's aqiqah. And then when first grandchild comes, you take out the $15, which is supposed to preserve your blood and sweat, and you find you can only get chicken. You cannot get a kharoof for that. So it erodes the value. I remember reading in 1973 or 74 in Time magazine, Volkswagen Beetle, everybody knows that car, was sold for, brand new, was less than $800, right? And if somebody's grandfather had saved $750 to give their grandchild a graduation present today, they would be lucky if they can get 4 wheels, not the whole car. Right? So it does not preserve the value of their savings. What does the Quran have to say about this? Does Quran have to say something about this? The Quran says, لا تبخسوا الناس أشياءهم. Do not diminish the value of possessions. And we shouldn't have a simplistic understanding of this. Either someone wants to sell us a 3-year-old Toyota Camry worth maybe $15,000, $18,000, and we say, okay, I'll give you $900 for it. No, it's not just that. The Quran is asking us to know. We should have a very sophisticated understanding of what the Quran is trying to tell us. Do not diminish the value of people's possession. If you do it in style through inflation, it's a bigger sin. It's a bigger problem. It's a bigger facade. Right? And we should also try to understand why individual countries were not permitted to link their currencies to gold. Of course, the reason that was given at that time, you don't need to. You're linked to dollar. The dollar is linked to gold. But that is not based on sincerity. I want to give you some examples over here. For example, today, $1 is equivalent to, I'm not sure exactly how many, but I think roughly 100 Pakistani rupees, right? 100 rupees, roughly. Right? And say Pakistan has a foreign debt of $1 billion. So they have a foreign debt of 100 billion rupees. And since they transact in rupees, you go, the cab driver gets rupees, the rickshaw driver gets rupees, the mechanic, the grocer, etc., right? $100 billion. Then one fine morning you wake up and you find that the exchange rate is 110 rupees to a dollar. What happened? Pakistan's foreign debt increased by 10% because you transact in rupees. But when you pay your masters or you pay the earners, you have to pay in dollars. And how much say do the people of Pakistan, or any country for that matter, have in that exchange rate? None. No. And this is not the result of pure market forces. Like we hear in the weather forecast, there's a high pressure system sitting off the coast, and then that's why the temperatures are going to be warm for the next 3 days. That's nature, right? This is not free. This is not through natural forces. I remember the time when one South African rand was equal to $1.10 or $1.15, stronger than dollar, right? Today it stands at more than 12.5 rands to a dollar. When the apartheid government changed and the new government came in South Africa, Nelson Mandela's time, many of you were around, I think, some of you might remember, the rand dropped like 60% or so. I have my brother who lives there, and he and I were having a conversation. He said, I don't understand what happened. It was the smoothest transition, everything was fine. Next, within no time, within a very short time, the value just dropped. What happened to us? Our industry is the same, our production is the same. So it is not a result of free market forces or free forces. So, but there was, on the other hand, this refusal to redeem meant that the system was about to go. It was not going to survive, right? Once you break the key foundation, the system was going to go, right? So something had to be done to shore up the dollar. The dollar monopoly was going to be over. Something had to be done, right? And that leads us to a small chapter in Perkins' second book, and he has titled that chapter King Dollar. Okay, so we'll learn about that, inshallah. Shortly after Nixon, you can say, ripped apart or tore that Bretton Woods Accord and abandoned the gold standard, John Perkins was an economic hitman then. He was invited to dinner by the president of his company, Chastity, Maine. We said he works for this company out of Boston, right? Perkins at that time was in Jakarta, Indonesia, doing his job. And if you pick his book, you read his book, Confessions, you'll see there's interesting information about Indonesia, the country case of Indonesia. We didn't cover all the countries, but we covered the gist of it. We covered Ecuador, etc. So over there, he was invited to dinner. Mr. Daubers, who was the president of that, he was on the way to Middle East and he stopped on the way in Jakarta. So he invited John Perkins for dinner, right? And during light conversation over dinner, Mr. Daubers, Jake Daubers, he mentioned, so what's going to happen to the dollar? And he said, in the end, I suppose, he said, its value will be determined by oil. Remember, this is 1971, possibly 72. Shortly after Nixon tore apart the accord. Possibly 72, but probably 71, right? And so Dauber said Nixon had a very smart team working for him, comprising of Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Dick Cheney. Then he looked into his wife's eyes and said, I anticipate the day when we'll sit back on our sofa and say, we were part of this great adventure. Notice the word, part of this great adventure. And he said that the US is launching, year 1970 or 72, when he said it. The US is launching a new period in world history, and we've got the front seats to the show. He said, we'll sit on our sofa and say that he's looking into his wife's eyes and say that, right? Note that whatever Daubers was referring to, he characterized it or described it as a new period in world history. That means something monumental, right? Of course, he was part of the system, right? He was the head of that company that Perkins worked for, president of that company. Perkins said that Nixon's team, as Dauber said, was smart. They said they were not just smart, they were actually cunning. And that Washington's first ally in this struggle to shore up the dollar, which was going to go down because of the Bretton Woods falling apart, Washington's first ally in this was Israel in the struggle to maintain the hegemony of dollar. And Washington's second ally in this were the Islamic countries of the Middle East. And he said they were unsuspecting allies in this, somewhat unsuspecting allies. They were clueless about the game. Maybe our countries there have become smart now. I do not know if they have become smart, but at least he says they were clueless about this game. So what happened? On October 6, 1973, I don't see many people who might remember that. I remember. On 1970, Egypt and Syria simultaneously attacked Israel. And this was in response to the 1967 preemptive strike that Israel made, as a result of which Israel quadrupled its territory. Remember, they took the Golan Heights, they took the Sinai Peninsula, so they were sitting on the east shore of the Suez Canal, right? Huh? Yeah. On the east, and they took the West Bank. 1967, they took the West Bank, right? Quds was completely gone at that time in 1967. And so, what Perkins says that the main gain, the key gain of the 1967 war was not territory, that quadrupled Israel's territory. It was not territory. He said the key gain was the humiliation of Arabs, which would be very skillfully and cunningly leveraged 6 years later. And we'll find out about this. So when this was happening in 1973, Anwar Sadat, who was then the head of Egypt, he was the president, and much more than a president, was Egypt. He urged King Faisal, of Saudi Arabia. King Faisal had very close to his heart Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. Yeah. When he urged King Faisal to use, quote-unquote, the oil weapon, right? So in the middle of October of that month, of that year, 1973, the Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries announced a 70% hike in the price of oil. And in solidarity, Iran came on board, and Iran also hiked the price 70%. And in the following days, the Arab oil ministers met together somewhere, and they unanimously backed the idea in principle. Okay, they backed the idea of an embargo against the United States. They didn't declare. They backed the idea because of the United States' uncritical support for Israel, for its overly pro-Israel leanings. And they were obviously upset at this U.S. support for Israeli aggression. And Perkins says this was a classic calculated move of international chess. On October 19, after the oil ministers had backed the idea in principle, Nixon went to the Congress and proposed to the Congress $2.2 billion in aid to Israel. And that obviously upset the Arabs, right? And next day, the country is struck by declaring a total oil embargo against the United States. No oil shipments to the United States, right? Perkins says that at that time, few people realized the cunning behind Washington's move. Few people realized that the move was driven by the determination to reestablish the dollar. That was the game. Few people realized it, he says. So the embargo had an enormous impact. By January 1st, 1974, 73 was the year when the war occurred. January 1st, 1974, the price of crude oil was 7 times what it was on January 1st, 1970. So in 4 years, it has gone up 7 times. People were upset. There were big lines at gas stations, etc., and people feared that the United States might go into a depression like the Great Depression of the late 1920s, 1929 to be more specific. And he says that the corporatocracy, we explained this term last time, he coined this term to describe the system used by these wealthy families and corporations whereby media and bureaucrats and government, etc., are connected into this web to actually implement their agenda. He calls that corporatocracy. Corporatocracy played an active role in driving the oil prices so high. Outwardly, the business leaders and political leaders, they expressed outrage at the high, very high price of oil. But inwardly and privately, they were the puppet masters who were pulling the strings to get the oil prices high. Perkins. And it'll become clearer now, inshallah, as we go through. And Nixon and his advisors knew very well that the proposal to give $2.2 billion package for Israel, that included military aid also, was an extremely provocative act, especially at that time. And that will force the Arabs to take some drastic actions, right? And the Arabs did exactly as the movers of the chess pieces had calculated. So they behaved like perfect pawns. Somebody moves you from this position to there, you move from this position to there on the chessboard. With that move, the U.S. administration generated what Perkins calls, and this is Perkins' description of that, the craftiest and the most significant economic hitman deal of the 20th century. The craftiest and the most significant economic hitman deal of the 20th century. So the U.S. Treasury Department at that time contacted Maine, who was the employer of Chastity, main employer of Perkins, and other firms who were, in the economic hitman business, you can say. And their assignments were twofold. They were given 2 assignments. One was to formulate a strategy to ensure that OPEC and those oil countries will recirculate, they'll funnel the billions of dollars back to U.S. companies and U.S. Treasury in terms of securities, Treasury bonds, etc. And the second, which was the more important task, as Perkins says, was to establish a new oil standard that will replace the former gold standard, the former fake gold standard. We know, we just saw about Bretton Woods, right? It wasn't a real gold standard, you can say. They used the gold linkage to make it more respectable, to make it appear like it had integrity. So the economic hitman knew that the key to the success in this assignment was Saudi Arabia, because she had the most oil and she produced the most oil, right? And most oil reserves also. Perkins said that the Saudis understood the language or the politics of colonialism. They understood it. Because he says, after all, the royalty was bestowed upon Al Saud family by the British. And they knew, the economic hitmen knew this, and they knew that they are corrupt. So the hitmen went to work, and an agreement was worked out. And there were different parts of the agreement. The first part of the agreement was that Saudi Arabia will invest a large portion of its earnings in U.S. government securities. Number two, second was the U.S. Treasury Department will use the interest on these billions of dollars in Treasury security to hire American companies to westernize Saudi Arabia in terms of development. That was number two, right? And third condition was the price of oil would be maintained within some range acceptable to the system or the corporate ocracy, right? Now, the system worked well. Last year I checked the numbers. I do not know about this year. These numbers are from last year, 15 months ago. Saudi Arabia had $1.7 trillion in U.S. treasuries, bonds or securities. I do not know what the numbers are this year. Maybe more, maybe less. I have no idea. Now, all these things were generally reported in the media at that time. But there was another key agreement that was reached that was not reported. That key agreement was not reported. And Perkins points to this agreement that under this agreement, Saudi Arabia agreed to trade oil exclusively only in dollars. Now thereby you're creating demand for dollars, right? Every country needs oil. So they'll need to get dollars if they want to buy oil, right? So automatically the demand is there for dollars, right? And this agreement was negotiated by Henry Kissinger. There were discussions between King Faisal and Henry Kissinger also. And this was the deal of the century. And Perkins says that with the scratch of a pen, with that agreement, with the Saudis, with a scratch of a pen, the dollar monopoly was restored. The dollar domination was reestablished. Oil replaced gold, Perkins writes. And if you remember, maybe this will take another talk, inshallah. If Allah permits us to get together, we'll explain in hadith with respect to this and its implications. We now know a bit more about what happened and how it was done, about this cunning chess game. Because 3 years ago, 3 and some months, in February 2012, the Vinogradov papers were published. And has anybody heard about the Vinogradov papers? Okay. Vladimir Vinogradov was the Soviet ambassador to Cairo. He was there during the 1973 war. He was the ambassador from 1971 to 1974, right? So these papers are his diaries, what he wrote in his diaries. His official diary, transcript of his diaries. And he described the 1973 war, which is known as the Yom Kippur War. He described it as a collusive enterprise between collusion means cooperation, but in a negative way. Collusion, like conspiring, right? A collusive enterprise between American, Egyptian, and Israeli leaders orchestrated by Henry Kissinger. And I'm quoting, this is Vinogradov papers. According to Vladimir Vinogradov, Anwar Sadat, who was the president, he was the prime minister, he was ASU chairman. I don't know what ASU.
He was VP.
Huh?
He was VP.
Uh-huh.
He was VP of the NASA, and then he became president.
Yeah, but at that time, he was the supreme military ruler, he was the chief commander, he was the president, he had all the power. So he had so many portfolios with him, right? He entered into a conspiracy with Israelis. This is Vinogradov revealing it. Vinogradov is a very remarkable diplomat and astute diplomat with a stellar record of his career. And he says that Egypt, Anwar Sadat entered into a conspiracy with the Israelis, betrayed his ally Syria, condemned the Syrian army to destruction, condemned Damascus to bombardment, allowed Ariel Sharon's tank to come to the western side of the Suez. When the Israelis were sitting on the east side of the Suez and the Egyptians were on the west side of the Suez Canal. And he says he actually planned the defeat of the Egyptian troops. Wow. Quite serious, right? This is Vinogradov saying, right? So the chess game was like this. This was to ensure that the war ended in some sort of draw. And so that after this, the United States would appear to feel compelled that the Arabs can win a war, to come as an honest broker. So it could re-enter Middle East. It was not in Egypt. The Soviet experts were sitting in Egypt. But before the war started, Sadat kicked them out. He wondered, he was going to start a war and all the sophisticated equipment was to man. You probably need your country, a big country that is backing you. But he kicked them out. And an entryway was opened for America to come in there and as an honest broker and to reestablish her credibility in the Middle East before asking that oil be exclusively priced in dollars. So this was the game. Perkins says this, Vinogradov says this. This is all. So about Vinogradov papers, actually, when I read was a lengthy article by Israel Shamir. He's an Israeli journalist, a very good journalist who writes from Moscow. And when Vinogradov papers were released, he wrote a lengthy article on this. And Israel Shamir has some credibility to write about that. He has some credibility. He used to be in the Israeli army. He fought in the 1973 war. He was in the Sinai desert, And so he writes that thanks to this American takeover of Egypt, the dollar decline was reversed and Saudi and Gulf oil. When you work on Saudi Arabia, obviously the other Gulf countries, they just sort of fall in line. And so you have an amplification of the impact of your negotiations with Saudi Arabia. So so this oil being sold in dollars became the new lifeline for the American empire. Okay, and he concludes that he says, Israel Shamir says, we can confidently say that this 1973-74 marks a decisive turning point in our history. Note these words, not very different from what Jake Dauber said, right? A new period in world's history, something similar, right? And I want to go over, some of the other things that Vinogradov wrote about his experience there, Vinogradov used to see Sadat every day, multiple times. He was the Soviet ambassador, the chief backer for years of Egypt against Israel, right? And they had Soviet equipment, which was superior to the equipment that the Israelis had, because it performed well in the sand in the desert, right? But the American equipment at that time did not perform as well. He said when they crossed, now we know it appears like it was arranged, when they crossed and went to the other side of the Suez, to the east, right? And they cracked through what was called a Bar-Leaf line. Anybody know Bar-Leaf line? Remember? Yeah, Bar-Leaf line. And I remember the credit went to, I think, General Saaduddin Shazli. I think he was the general there or something at that time, right? So when they crossed over, they stayed put over there. So Vinogradov who had the ear of Sadat, he told Sadat, why don't you go into Sinai? Why you cross the Suez? Why not go further? And Sadat told him, I'm not going to have my soldiers looking for Israelis in this desert of Sinai. Okay. Then there was another development, and he talks about multiple developments, was that there was a 40-kilometer gap, or 40 miles, I think 40 kilometers, between the First Army and the Third Army of Egypt that permitted Ariel Sharon's tanks to cross on the other side of the Suez, right? This gap was left, and Vinogradov said, why don't you fill up the gap? And when the tanks cross, why don't you finish them off, because they're on this side. He said, he's not going to waste his resources on a few tanks. And I said, besides, it's only a political move. This is what Vinogradov said. And he says that he thought at that time that Sadat's remarks, this about not pursuing them in desert and not taking care of these tanks that cross. So he said he felt his remarks were insincere and foolish. So obviously Perkins, his boss Jake Daubers, Israel Shamir, Ambassador Vinogradov, all characterized this development of oil being sold in dollars and shoring up dollar and reestablishing its hegemony as a monumental thing. But we don't see Islamic scholars, Islamic academics talking about this, because it's a major development. It affects most people, right? Now let's look at the implication, and inshallah we're close, about 10 minutes time or so. Now let's look at the implication of oil being priced in dollars. First, the dollar itself is not backed by gold, we know that, right? Where does it come from? It's printed, right? So if you can print dollars, you just print dollars. You want to buy oil, you print dollars and you get oil. So you can essentially get oil for free. And other things for free also, right? That's one thing, right? But Perkins said that if only this one commodity, oil, is not traded in dollars, it will have, he said the dollar will collapse and it will have disastrous consequences for the United States. There's another angle, side effect, that when U.S. buys goods and services from some countries, right, it pays them with what is called as a dollar credit. And those countries use that dollar credit to buy oil. Everybody needs to buy oil. Oil is a big bill for many countries, most countries, right? But before they use that credit to actually get oil, it's many months since the United States had paid them with credit. It's not an absolute payment in gold or something, it's credit. But what happens? By that time, inflation has eroded some of the value of that credit. So this is like an indirect tax that the United States collects on those oil transactions that those countries undergo. So now, a comment on globalization. Consider the holy mantra of globalization, right? You're supposed to accept it. MashaAllah, it's very good, wonderful. Free flow of capital, free flow of goods and services, equal opportunity for everybody, private sector flourishing and people becoming wealthy and prospering, etc., etc. You see, U.S. corporations armed with printer dollars, if you have the capacity to print dollars, right, they could go to any country and buy their precious resources because they're printing dollars, which everybody accepts as the currency for international trade, etc. And they can go and buy their precious resources like power companies, water companies, resources, lakes, minerals, etc., all for a song. They can buy it, right? And this has happened in Bolivia, not today's Bolivia under Evo Morales, no, but before Evo Morales' time, that some of the U.S. corporations actually bought the lakes and waters, the waters of Bolivia, drinking water, all waters of Bolivia. And there was an uproar, such an uproar, people were up in arms, that the government was forced to cancel that and take it away from the corporations. So now, a comment on what happened to the gold that all countries deposited, right, with IMF And then, of course, subsequently, of course, they are supposed to get it. What happened to that gold? We don't know what happened to that gold. Another question, what happens to the U.S. gold? U.S. has supposedly its own reserves in gold, sitting in Fort Knox in Kentucky. Okay, what happened to that gold? Where is it? The U.S. has not done any audit of that gold for more than 60 years. If you know Congressman Ron Paul, he was running for president in the last elections. Ron Paul had been demanding an audit of the gold. The gold audit has not been done. Why is it so difficult for that audit to do? If you work for federal government, unless the government gives you a laptop, right, it will be identified as an asset. It will have an asset number, probably one of those, barcodes and things like that. It will have an asset. It will be tracked because it is public asset, right? And if you have to do an auditing of those assets, which happens probably every 2 years or whatever in government, right? It's a major enterprise, right? Government offices and properties and everything in thousands of locations, and probably hundreds of thousands, if not maybe many tens of thousands of different kinds of things you have to track. But the auditing of gold is very simple. It's a bar that looks like this. All bars are of the same size. All you have to do is count how many bars and multiply them by the weight of the gold or the value. Its audit is simple. It's not a monumental task. But that's not being done. So one has to wonder what. I can imagine a government not auditing its own gold reserves. It's not funny. Now, lately a new challenge has emerged to the dollar hegemony. It's in the form of BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries have established a new trading bloc in which they settle their trade in their own currencies rather than dollars. So this is a challenge, right? They've established a BRICS bank for settlement of these accounts. And other countries are joining in. And as you can see, this naturally has an effect in diminishing the demand for dollar, right? It's no longer needed for that massive international trade between all these big countries, right? Another challenge which has emerged, and this is only in the last couple of months, maybe 1 month, a month ago or so, when China established this AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And many countries are joining in, even countries in Europe are joining in. This is sort of like an IMF, but not an IMF. So this has already attracted many countries. The AIIB will finance infrastructure development projects, right, in developing countries, but it would be without the economic hitmen, it will be without jackals, it will be without debt entrapment, and it will be without wars. In 1997, there was an IMF crisis, and this is in Perkins' second book. So in Southeast Asia, countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Laos, and South Korea, they were hit hard. And they had all bought, Malaysia also, they had all bought into this IMF ideology, and World Bank ideology. And when these countries were unable to service their debt, paying interest on the debt, they were in trouble, right? Then IMF came up with a quote-unquote rescue plan. We talked about the rescue plan. Now, what was the rescue plan? Rescue plan that IMF came up with is more loans. More loans, but this came with a condition, with a caveat, that those countries have to agree to certain structural adjustments. What were the structural adjustments? It's a very fancy name for what, they have to cut subsidies on fuel, cut subsidies on grains and food, increase taxes maybe on bus travel, train travel, cut the amount of money allocated to services for the poor, essentially things that make life difficult for people, and plus open up the country's access to privatization. This was supposed to be the rescue plan. Malaysia was one country that refused the diktat of the IMF on this, refused this structural adjustment. And they came out of this crisis much faster. And they fared much better than the rest of the countries which took the bait and went into the IMF plan. So you get a flavor of what Perkins wrote about this system, and I re-emphasize this again, that these plans that are brought, essentially, this adjustment, this help, essentially, is, in simple language, you can say it is, you dig yourself a deeper hole now. That is the answer. How do you get out of this hole? You dig your hole deeper. This is the answer. And this is all, at the core of this all, as we saw, is riba. If you have any confusion about the definition of why this is riba or not, inflation, is it riba or not? It is riba. Riba has 70 parts. Remember, we talked about it last time. So I hope you found this interesting and useful. Inshallah, we can do questions and answers either now or whenever you wish. I'm here. I will conclude here. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum.